Okay, so our next speaker, Dr. Gary Geller, has a PhD from UCLA in biology and ecology, and he works at JPL, where he's been supporting NASA's ecological forecasting programs for many years. He got involved with GeoBond as a steering committee member when it started. And after learning about essential climate variables, he suggested to GeoBond to develop essential biodiversity variables, the EBVs, which he'll talk about today. And he also recommended to GEO that all disciplines develop these essential variables. He was seconded by NASA as the GEO Secretariat in Geneva for 2 years, where he oversaw the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Sustainability Societal Benefit Area. And his talk today will be on biodiversity policy, assessing progress towards policy goals. Let's welcome Dr. Gary Geller.
Thanks. Oh, you're going to start the timer, darn. So I should be okay. So if I were going to categorize the talks that we've seen so far, maybe Janine's talk would be, she started off largely as a why talk. Why is biodiversity important? Why is monitoring important? And then she shifted to a what. What is biodiversity? And all the different aspects of that. Great talk, Janine. Still need to learn all that stuff. And then the next two talks maybe were how talks. Kyle talked about how to use radar data and other types of data to collect the measurements to understand that biodiversity. And then Phil also talked about spectroscopy, again, additional measurements for that. And then Rob, another how talk maybe, where he talked about, well, how can we use those measurements and other measurements to understand where species live? Well, my talk is maybe more of a why talk. Why is it important? Why is monitoring important, and so forth? And maybe a little bit of a who talk, because the why is for monitoring, the who is for policy people who are responsible for implementing policy and achieving the goals that they set out in their policies. So I'll start off with an overview of three of probably the key biodiversity-related policies, talk a little bit about how to assess progress towards those policy goals, and then talk about monitoring, in particular GeoBond, the Biodiversity Observation Network, and the essential biodiversity variable framework that's part of that. So the first one I'll talk about is the UN Convention on Biodiversity. It's been in force since 1993. There are 196 states that have signed on to that, which is basically every state in the world except for the Holy See, which is the Vatican, and the US, which did sign it, but it hasn't been ratified. This is how they define biological diversity. Very broad definition. Janine showed some other definitions, but they're all very broad and very inclusive, all the way from gene, species, and ecosystems. But the focus for the CBD is on both the conservation and the sustainable use of biological diversity. And that sort of dual perspective is also true in some of the other policies as well. They developed around in the 2010 timeframe, they developed what they call the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020, which included what's called the Aichi targets. Aichi is a city in Japan where they agreed on this, and there's 20 of those. This followed the 2010 biodiversity target, which really wasn't met very well. So they refined their plan, became a little bit more specific and somewhat more realistic as well with their targets. There's a lot of progress. We're 8 years into this now. There has been a lot of progress, but it's probably likely that most of those targets will also not be met. And just to give you, I won't go through all of these, but the ones that I think this group is interested in is in here. These others tend to do with documentation and resources, but it's about decreasing biodiversity loss, sustainable fisheries, and so forth, invasive species, coral reefs, protected areas, preventing extinctions, things related to genes and ecosystem resilience. So that should give you sort of a flavor of the different goals that they have. And each of these goals has some measures that they use called indicators to assess the progress towards achieving those. The next one I wanted to mention is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which has been in force since 1975. This has 170 contracting parties, each of which is responsible for identifying sites that wetland sites in their area, in their country, that they believe are of international importance. The Ramsar folks then go through a process to approve that, and there are now about 2,300 sites that vary in size from just a few hectares to several tens of thousands of hectares. So that's what the Ramsar people do. Again, this is sort of their motto: conservation and wise use of wetlands. Wise use, I think the phrase for that now is sustainability. So again, it's sort of a dichotomous view of using the wetlands resource for both of these things. Now, it's interesting, they take a very broad definition of wetlands. There's the traditional wetlands that we think of, marshes and estuaries and so forth, but they also include rivers and lakes, all of them. Marine areas up to 6 meters in depth, so that includes coral reefs, at least tropical coral reefs. Also human sites, like rice paddies and so forth. And not on the list, I believe aquifers are also part of the treaty. So it's a very, very broad definition of wetlands. They have actually 4 strategic goals. The 3 of interest here are these 3. They want to address the drivers of loss and degradation of wetlands. Obviously, they want to conserve and manage their site network. They have so many sites, and that is important to them. So every one of the contracting parties is responsible for meeting the successful management criteria for the sites that are within their area. And then again, the wise use or sustainable use of all wetlands. So altogether, these goals, there are 17 specific targets, which I won't go into, but again, they have indicators associated with those. And then the last one I wanted to talk about is much more recent, and almost in a sense, it's become an umbrella policy for some of the others. And as these other conventions are refined, they're tending to sort of incorporate themselves into these SDGs. So it's very new. It started, it went into force in January of 2016. There are 193 states, basically everyone, including the US, is on board with this. And they have a total of 17 SDGs. What's interesting is remote sensing, which I think is what we're mostly interested in here, really infuses in one way or another into all 17 of these. But the 3, I think, that we're, in terms of biodiversity, are most interested in are these here. One dealing with water, one with life below water, which is the marine area, and then life on land. This is really important for policy, thinking about policy. So I wanted to actually go through some of the specifics here that's relevant to us. So this is the overall goal here, to ensure access to water and sanitation for all, for goal 6. But the piece of that that's relevant to us is target 6.6, which is to protect and restore water-related ecosystems. So as you can imagine, the Ramsar folks are very interested in this, and they're actually I think the formal agency that's in charge of developing the indicators and so forth for this particular goal and target. So the next one is the marine one, and this is the text here for goal 14, conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources. So there's a whole bunch of different targets within that, but the 3 of interest to us, I think, are these here: to sustainably manage marine and coastal ecosystems, regulate harvesting and overfishing, and enhance the sustainable use of oceans. So there's a big, as you might expect, SDGs, the S is for sustainability. This is largely about sustainability, but conservation is implicit in any kind of sustainable management. And then the last one is goal 15, which is on land. And it's obviously, this was developed by committee, and it's very, very broad and inclusive. But I wanted to read it because it'll give you a flavor for its breadth. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. So it's basically everything on land that we might be interested in. And the specific targets of interest to us are here. There's one on freshwater, another on forest, another on what's called land degradation neutrality, that the UN Convention to Combat Desertification is leading the charge on that one, although it's not just about deserts. Also, there's something on mountains, another on biodiversity loss, and something on invasive alien species. So I think that gives you an overview of the different policies. It's not exciting, but it's also very easy to absorb compared to some of the other talks maybe that were very conceptual and technical. So what I wanted to do now is to just very briefly talk about ways to assess progress. And I mentioned indicators. I think you all know what that implies, but an indicator is just it's some sort of variable that provides information on the condition of some aspect of interest to, in this case, to these policies and their targets. They're very formalized. They're very standardized. There are committees for the SDGs, for example. There are these multinational, multi-agency committees that discuss what these indicators should be. And they've actually looked at the suggested indicators and put them into 3 different categories depending upon their readiness level. So it's a big deal. And one reason they make such a big deal about this is that these are actually mandatory for all the parties to these conventions, or to the SDGs and the other conventions as well. They have to report on these specific indicators. And the reason they want everyone to report on the same kinds of things is to get standardization so that they can compare progress in different countries and different parts of the world. And I don't think they actually say this. It also allows them to shame maybe those countries that maybe haven't done as good a job reaching their goals. Every target has indicators. So there's 169 targets. There's about 250 indicators. So every target has 1 or maybe 2 indicators, or in some cases 3 indicators. Just a few samples. This one's very straightforward. The forest area is a proportion of total land area. Well, if that forest, if you're losing forest, then that proportion is going to go down. That's very straightforward. The red list index is another indicator. If you're familiar with that, that's the a creation of IUCN. It's been around for decades, I think. And it's the looks at actually thousands of species based on contributions by hundreds or thousands of research scientists that have studied the population trends in various species. And they give, each species gets a category depending on the risk to extinction. So the red list index is another indicator. And then one that's a little bit vague, but I wanted you to see that all these indicators aren't just black and white, is this next one, progress towards sustainable forest management. Well, how do you measure progress? That's really up to the entity that's defining that. So the other thing, and Janine talked about this, and she knows a lot more about this than I do because she's on at least one of the assessments, is the intergovernmental science policy platform in biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the science policy part is very important. It's really at the interface of these 2 things. It was established in 2012. I guess their motto might be better policy through science. And what they do is they provide policymakers with what they call assessments. And an assessment is a multi-year task where existing research information is processed and integrated into a report that provides information on this current state of whatever it is that the assessment is about. I think the first one, and Janine, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the first one was on pollinators. Another one came out, I think it was earlier this year, on land degradation. Bob Scholes, if you know him, he's the former chair of GeoBond, was one of the co-leads on that assessment. And then there's another one coming up. I don't know what the time. That just came out. And there are regional assessments as well that I think are by continent. And those are done, right, Janine? Before, yeah. And then I guess the next big one is this global assessment in biodiversity and ecosystem services, which has been in progress for a couple years. Is that right? Yeah. So that'll be, I think, an interesting one. All of them are interesting, actually. So this is an interesting figure. This was a favorite figure of Anne-Laure Gauderie, who was on the GeoBond Steering Committee, and she's now the executive director of IPBES. And what it shows is the relationship, how these assessments fit into sort of the larger landscape. So IPBES does these assessments based on research that is provided, that's just out there in the literature and so forth. And the experts, there are committees who develop the assessment, who author the assessments that are familiar with the research. And then it moves, the result of that then gets passed on to policy. So in the case of IPBES, that's the CBD. Another assessment body is the IPCC, the climate folks, and in that case, that would be passed on to the UNFCCC. And then we have GEOBON, which I'll talk about in a minute, sits here, which is really a monitoring system that's under development, and it feeds its results both into research, so that the research has the observations, or at least some of the observations that they need to do a good job, but also maybe in products that are somewhat more derived, passes this information on to policy, and hopefully in a form and with tools that help them apply it to solve the problems they're trying to solve. So that's sort of the big picture for how these different pieces fit together. So now I wanted to talk about monitoring, in particular GEOBON and essential biodiversity variables. Well, the weather monitoring folks have a great gig. They've spent tens of billions of dollars. They've got things in space. They have aircraft. They've got these giant ships, buoys, all these stations on the ground. They're launching balloons. And then all of this stuff gets formatted and standardized and comes into these centralized locations that then can be processed in the US. NOAA does that processing. And they come out with a weather forecast, which is actually really, really accurate. And it's not just at the national level. These national systems have been put together into a coordinated network that allows them to share data, which is critical for doing weather analyses, but also for making climate predictions. So this is fantastic. For biodiversity, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. I mean, we have people on the ground squeezing frogs and swatting mosquitoes and things like that. There's more to it than just the in situ data, of course, but we don't have a biodiversity monitoring system, anything like the weather people do. And that's really, in a sense, that's GEOBON's goal, although we'll never have all those big ships and stuff like those guys do. So GEOBON is the Group on Earth Observation Biodiversity Observation Network, which started just 10 years ago now. It's still very much a work in progress. The mission is to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observation. So acquisition, that's making the measurements, making the observations, both in situ as well as remotely sensed observations. Coordination, that's the networking side, because there's really no other way to do it but to have networks in countries or on different themes and so forth. And then delivery, that's the connection to the end user, which are on the one hand, it's the research people, and then on the other hand, it's the policy people. And and I'll try not to rant on this, they need different kinds of delivery systems. The research people, they all have graduate students who can understand these complicated formats and so forth. But that park ranger I mentioned before, he doesn't have any of that. He's busy shooting poachers or whatever else he's doing. So he needs a different kind of delivery system that caters more to him and delivers more derived products. So if you're going to build a global monitoring system, the first thing you need to do is to agree on what to measure. Well, in GEOBON, and I say we because I've been involved with it for a long time, we have a framework that we call essential biodiversity variables that I'll talk about, but it's basically the key things that you should be measuring to understand how biodiversity is changing. So once you have that, then you can start to build the networks that can actually measure this. So in GEOBON, the framework for that are called biodiversity observation networks. There are different flavors of this. There are national networks, and there's just a few of those at the moment, but the idea is to, in the end, have most countries have some sort of their own bond. There are regional networks as well, and then there are thematic networks, and one here that Frank Mueller-Karger, who's here in the corner, is leading, and Enrique Montes, who's somewhere here as well, is the Marine Bond, the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. There's also one for freshwater, and then maybe if it gets approved tomorrow in a call, I think they're also going to be developing a soil microbiodiversity bond, which is sort of interesting. So once you have these networks, well, that's not enough because particularly in biodiverse areas, the capacity there is low, both in terms of the skills and knowledge of many of the people there. There aren't as many, research is not supported as much, but also in terms of the computing environment and the other types of resources. So for this, GeoBond has something that's called Bond in a Box. And conceptually, Bond in a Box is this box that we would create, and we would hand it off to some country. And there's a little button on the outside, right? And you know, the agency lead in that country pushes that button, and then out pops this biodiversity observation network. What could be easier than that? Well, it's actually not quite that simple, but that's the concept. So it's a box of tools that provides information on the EBVs and different ways to measure those and so on. And it also provides what we might call dashboards or various ways for a user to understand progress towards various goals that might be, they might have obligations on. And then the last thing is to build a delivery system. And again, I'll try not to rant on this, but the Bond in a Box has some tools for that as well. And there's also some activities at the GeoBond Secretariat in Leipzig where they're developing some databases that would facilitate that as well. Well, the way GeoBond is structured, and maybe this isn't that interesting, but I wanted to make the point that for the EBVs, which I'll talk about in a minute, each type of EBV has its own working group. And if any of these are of interest to you, then I would invite you to join one of these working groups and participate. The working group I'm involved in is the Ecosystem Structure Working Group, but there are several that I'll talk about in a minute. And then on the bond side, I already mentioned we have a marine bond and some other bonds as well, and some national bonds also. So for a monitoring system, we have in situ data. That's great stuff because it's real, it's direct, it's people on the ground measuring things. The drawback is that it's very sparse. It's patchy in both space and time. So we can't do a global biodiversity monitoring system based only on in situ data. There are too many gaps. The reason for that is it's hard and expensive and there's a lot of bugs out there. So the complement to that is satellite remote sensing, which is global and periodic, so that can fill in the gaps that the in situ people aren't able to fill in. So that's good. Another good thing about it is that somebody else has already paid for it. You know, NASA and ESA and ISRO and JAXA and other organizations have already developed this massive infrastructure to collect information and process it and make it available. And I think later on in the week we'll be talking about maybe new ways to do that. The downside, of course, is that it doesn't actually measure a lot that's on the ground. A lot of what we know about biodiversity from space is through inference, by correlating what we can measure from space at 700 kilometers with information that the in situ people provide. So to make use of this stuff, we have to have a lot of good in situ data. I wanted to talk about EBVs now, and as I mentioned, these are just the measurements required. These are the key measurements maybe you want to make if you're going to study biodiversity change and be interested in that. It's very much a work in progress. I should mention that the inspiration for these was from the climate people who came out, starting in the early 90s. They started to realize that they wanted to standardize some of the things that that the modelers needed to run their climate models. And they wanted to provide that information to the modelers. So eventually, over more than a decade, maybe more like 15 years, they came out with a set of what are called essential climate variables that inspired these things. So we in GeoBond, we're still working on these. The value is that it can prioritize the observations that are made and the resources that lie behind those. We can't measure everything that we would like to measure, so it's very important to prioritize. And so EBVs are one way of doing that, at least for one class of measurements. It also facilitates systematic observations, which is very important if you're trying to share data or standardize data to do comparative analysis. If we just have a bunch of isolated silos with different types of information or even just different formats, it makes it very difficult to do these comparative analyses. And the third thing about EBVs is that the intent really is to provide information that can then be used to feed data into indicators and derive variables. So we have sort of a processing flow from left to right here, where we have more or less raw observations here processed into EBVs. Exactly how that processing occurs is not, we don't know that for all the EBVs yet. Then these EBVs can be the feedstock to these higher level indicators like those that the SDG people need, but also for the derived products that the park manager who's chasing poachers might need. And then these things then get fed into the various types of decision makers, as well as to researchers who need that or similar information as well. Well, to be an EBV, you got to meet certain criteria. And the first one is it's got to be biological. That may be obvious, but it means that not everything that's of relevance to biodiversity conservation is going to be captured in this set of EBVs, and that's intentional. If we did that, we'd have such a huge number of these things that we really couldn't manage them. So it has to be biological, has to be sensitive to change. Otherwise, if something's not sensitive to change, we may not really need to measure it. It has to be important and useful in some application area. Practical, meaning if it's too expensive or the technology isn't there yet, then, well, it's probably not something we want to focus on yet. In an ideal world, they would be ecosystem agnostic. That's a challenge because what we need for a marine system may be different from grasslands, may be different from a forest, but that's the general idea. We want these sort of essential elements of biodiversity. And lastly, for the most part, they focus on state. If you're familiar with the DIPSR framework, drivers, pressures, states, response, and threats is in the mix there. We don't cover all of those. It's really focused on the S part of DIPSR, the state side of things. They'll probably be updated about every 5 years or so, and I mention that because once they're decided, we're not locked into that forever, and that's similar to the approach that the climate people take. And I already mentioned they're not all-encompassing. If you're going to be doing biodiversity research, you're going to need more than just these EBVs. You'll need other biological information. For policy, you'll probably need socioeconomic information. So it's not everything that you need to do the analyses. Just some examples here. They tend to fall into 6 classes. So genetic composition, populations of species, so distribution and abundance, like Rob was talking about, is key there. Species traits, a huge thing, and I don't have my head around this. I hope I can get a little bit more comfortable with it in the coming week, because there are so many traits. This might be one that's of interest to fisheries people or animal people in particular. Community composition, the taxonomic diversity, and then we have ecosystem function and structure, maybe net primary productivity and ecosystem extent, or the vertical structure of an ecosystem would be examples there. For us, who's interested in remote sensing, probably these are the 3 categories of most interest. For me, I focus mostly on these 2, but particularly the ecosystem structure one. Well, what are the next steps? Well, the first thing we need to do is to converge on a set of EBVs. That's a real challenge. Everyone has their own pet peeve. It's, oh, this is what's most important, or that's most important. So it's really more of a social challenge than a technical one. So we're gradually converging on that set, but and more so in some classes than others. I think the species populations ones, for example, is probably the most advanced. Once we do that, we can then refine the definitions of just what that EBV really means. Most EBVs have some sort of subvariables associated with it. So for traits, for example, maybe we have a category of traits, and then there are a set of specific traits that are maybe the most important ones to capture that category. And then we need to plan the implementation. So how do we get the observations? How do we process them into the EBVs? And then how do we deliver them? So what are some of the challenges to monitoring? I think I just have one slide on this. Funding it's the challenge probably for everything that we want to do. But monitoring is particularly challenging for funding because it's not something that NGOs are very interested in because it requires a long-term commitment. So most of the funding for monitoring is going to come from governments, and that's one reason why in GeoBond we focus on national bonds, for example, and working with government agencies in particular, although not exclusively. Agreement on who the target users are, there's always a lot of discussion in that. Well, is it the research folks or is it the policy folks? And the answer is it's really both, but they do, like I mentioned before, require maybe different sets of products and may have somewhat different needs, and that complicates the discussion somewhat. Prioritization is a challenge. I mentioned that for EBVs because everyone has sort of their own priorities. Capacity, I also mentioned already, particularly in biodiverse areas. Capacity isn't the same as it is in US and Europe, for example. And then the last bit, these two things are both applying this information and delivering it to the users that we've identified can be challenging. Some of the work involved in creating these derived products is very, very extensive. It may involve bringing together multiple sources of information, going through a whole suite of complicated processing steps, maybe even some validation if it's a model or something like that, and then coming out with this single derived product that's going to be of use maybe to a policymaker. That can be very complicated and difficult. In fact, I know there's one example of that where this person has a 3-year proposal that was funded, and the entire work is only to go through that process and come out with a single parameter for the trends in forest health. So just some closing thoughts. And something, again, one of my pet peeves is whatever we do, we need to think about who the users are and what their needs are. We don't want to just talk about technologies that are fun for us, but that don't actually have an application that's going to facilitate improved monitoring of biodiversity. So that's the first thing. And then I thought maybe just ending with a couple of closing thoughts here, things that I'm interested in and captured in here. The first, what are the limiting factors to good monitoring? If we can answer that, then we can start to focus on those limiting factors, particularly in this group and with this particular workshop. How can the advancing technologies that we'll be discussing address some of these limitations? That's it. Thanks a lot.